Hello, my name is Gareth Russell. This is my fourth very rough and ready video to distract and hopefully entertain during lockdown. It's part of my feeble but hopefully not too heinous efforts to provide some distraction. My previous videos have been looks at the lives of Anne Boleyn, William the Conqueror, and daily life on board the Titanic. I'm trying to take topics linked to subjects I covered in books I've written, and in this video I'll be looking at Tsar Nicholas II's mental health in the final days of the Russian monarchy to see if something serious impaired his ability to respond to the greatest crisis of the Romanov Empire. By way of a preemptive caveat or mea culpa, depending on your interpretation, I should take a swing at the whataboutery that hits historians. We're sometimes expected to discuss everything when in fact we've set out only to discuss something. This is not to say that the mental health or ill health of Nicholas II was the cause of the February Revolution. It is not to say that had he been in fighting spirits, it wouldn't have happened. It's also not to say the opposite. It is simply to discuss it as a factor. There are many excellent books on the Russian Revolution and biographies of the Emperor. I've studied it myself the last few years of his reign, in which I discuss all the other myriad factors that wove together to pull the Romanovs off their 3 centuries and a bit rule in Russia. So this is just really a look at why I believe Nicholas II did suffer some serious form of nervous breakdown. We have to be very careful applying psychological labels to people at the distance, because really you can't diagnose people unless you have the proper medical background, and crucially not unless you're in person. There are some signs, of course, that are fairly obvious, and I sort of will mention these as I go along, but I am not saying proof positive that Nicholas II had these, but I do think he had many of the symptoms, if that makes sense, and I hope we're sort of having a conversation about that rather than leaping to conclusions. Most of us are familiar with the image of Nicholas II, who ruled Russia as its emperor from his father's death in 1894 until his own abdication in 1917. That image, his reputation, is of a pathologically weak individual, the old trope of a good father and husband but a terrible monarch who never really wanted the panoply and prestige of ruling as a sovereign. I will argue here that this is fundamentally to misread Nicholas II and his crucial, devastating role in Russian history. Put simply, if Nicholas II had been as weak as we're led to believe, it's quite possible, ironically, that the final tragedy would have been averted. Either Nicholas would not have survived the great uprisings against his rule in 1905, which were far more widespread than the ones which actually brought him down 12 years later, or he would have caved to the pressure to provide Russia with a democratic constitution. This, again, is something he failed to do. He had been prepared to take seismic steps to reform and save the Russian monarchy in the face of the 1905 uprisings, but he was static, bafflingly, chillingly passive in 1916 and 1917. This is a personal take I have as a historian, which is that too often in history we let the end write the entirety. Hindsight is our scribe, and I think this is particularly true and misleading with the historiography of the Russian revolutions, particularly the February Revolution. We're told that it were inevitable, and that Nicholas II was the archetypal good man, bad king. However, the Nicholas of 1917 was a stranger to many of his advisors, his ministers, and even his own relatives. Something had gone terribly wrong with the Tsar around 1916, and using their letters and minutes from ministerial meetings, I'd like to share with you what those eyewitnesses saw. Nicholas succeeded to the Russian throne in fairly unexpected circumstances, aged 26 in November 1894, after his father, Tsar Alexander III, died following a short illness. The old Tsar's death from kidney failure, when he was still relatively young, he was in his 40s when he died, came as both a shock and bereavement to his eldest son, and It's this context, without its context, that I think is the source of the first misleading, hideously overquoted anecdote about Nicholas, which comes from the memoirs of his brother in law, the Grand Duke Alexander, who they called Sandro. Sandro tells this very moving story, and chilling in hindsight, that when Nicholas heard he had become Tsar, he burst into tears and said that he didn't know how to talk to the ministers, he had never wanted to become Tsar, what was going to happen. And people often say that this is grand proof that the entirety of Nicholas's career was going to end in cataclysmic failure. Well, 23 years is a very long time to wait for that failure to hit. I mean, he didn't fall off the throne for nearly a quarter of a century. And the tears and the panic, I would argue, are fairly natural reactions when his father had just died. And also, Alexander III really did not prepare Nicholas for the kind of minutiae of monarchy. He didn't explain to him the protocol of talking to the ministers. So even if Sandro is telling the truth, and some people think he exaggerates quite a lot in his memoirs, I don't think the story of Nicholas crying on the day of his father's death and worrying about becoming absolute monarch over the second largest empire in human history and ruling over hundreds of millions of people with little preparation really indicates that the entire Russian monarchy was going to come crumbling down his ears immediately. As I say, I would say that's a natural reaction to a father's death. And also, we have 23 years to get to before he became the greatest failure in the history of the Romanov dynasty. For the first 10 years of his reign, Nicholas was inclined to listen to the advice of his uncles, which was usually subpar, and I'm putting that as kindly as I can. With the exception of his uncle, the Grand Duke Paul, who he didn't really seem to listen to politically. Paul was young enough to almost feel like a brother or cousin. He also married a commoner and had to spend quite a lot of time abroad, so Paul was not the one he listened to, although that's fairly disappointing as of the brothers left alive, particularly compared to his uncles Sergei and Vladimir. Paul's advice probably would have been more preferable. Nicholas was also close to his mother, the Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna, whose advice was typically much more beneficial. I do think Nicholas's mother, who had been born a Danish princess, is hugely underrated. When Russia lost its war with Japan amid economic downturn, political unrest swept the empire in 1904 and into 1905, which Nicholas eventually, and it has to be said, very reluctantly, yielded to by granting Russia its first parliament, known as the Duma, created by its first elections. Nicholas did this partly to split the liberals away from the revolutionaries, dividing the monarchy's erstwhile opponents. And it certainly worked. One liberal politician famously exclaimed, "Thank God for the Tsar who has saved us from the people." Nicholas's letters from that time, especially those to his mother, reveal that he had been prepared to listen to advice and to bite the bullet, as it were. In one, he writes, "Around me, many, very many, held the same views. There was no other way out but to cross oneself and give what everyone was asking for. My only consolation is that such is the will of God, and this grave decision will lead my dear Russia out of the intolerable chaos she has been in for nearly a year." In the intervening years, several changes had taken place which combined to make Nicholas less likely to respond as effectively as he had to the crisis of 1905. No matter how reluctant he had been, he had done the right thing uh, by making those changes and signing the October Manifesto. The first change in the decade between the crisis of 1905 and the crises of 1915 through to 17 was a change in personal dynamic that followed the birth of Nicholas's son Alexei in 1904, and particularly the subsequent devastating diagnosis that the child had incurable and potentially lethal haemophilia, whereby his blood would not clot. To protect the heir to the throne from prying public eyes, the public were never told he had a potentially lethal illness, and to keep the boy from harm, The imperial family spent less and less time in St. Petersburg and more time residing in the imperial village come compound outside the capital, Zarskie Selo, in relative seclusion. This was compounded by the increasing health problems of Nicholas's wife Alexandra, who suffered from sciatica and heart palpitations. The Empress also intensely disliked what she saw as the extravagance and frivolity of upper class society. She was pathologically shy, and she was uncomfortable with many of her in laws. This all meant that Nicholas gradually lost touch with the upper classes, who, for better or for worse, were his peers, and they had constituted the many who advised him in 1904 and 1905. He also, crucially and damagingly, lost his formerly close relationship with his mother. It is not true that she was immediately replaced as political confidant by Alexandra, who really had zero political influence for the first 20 years of her husband's reign. In fact, if you read the memoirs of Alexandra's ladies in waiting, you'll be stunned by how little the Tsarina was told about her husband's policies before 1915. For instance, according to both Anna Virabova and Lily Den, the Empress didn't even know Russia had joined the First World War until after her husband had the announcement circulating on the streets of St. Petersburg. So, Alexandra's early influence over her husband has been seriously exaggerated, as too has the spectre of her spiritual advisor, the peasant preacher turned healer Grigory Rasputin. A notorious womanizer with a penchant for cheap vodka, Rasputin's soothing presence and homespun spirituality had the ability to soothe and smooth Alexei's worst bouts of hemophiliac bleeding. Most famously, Rasputin had managed to pull the 8-year-old heir back from the brink of death after a fall at the imperial family's hunting lodge in Poland. When he was at the palace, Rasputin played perfectly a man of gentle spirituality to the extent Alexandra refused to believe gossip about his drinking and promiscuity. She thought it was all jealous spite. Nicholas was more realistic about Rasputin, trusting in his police reports and even once banishing Rasputin from the capital after he got drunk and exposed himself at a restaurant. It's also worth noting that the rumours that Alexandra and Rasputin were lovers are now known to be totally absurd, but that's because we have access to Alexandra's correspondence, Rasputin's, Nicholas's, and also we know why Rasputin was always at the palace, because Nicholas kind of believed, and Alexandra definitely believed, that Rasputin could prevent their son from hemorrhaging to death through his prayers. But because the Russian public were not told that Alexei had this illness, they had to come up with some kind of reason as to why the Tsarina seemed so intent on protecting someone whom they believed to be a complete charlatan, and they came up with the ridiculous but not unreasonable, or sorry, inaccurate but not unreasonable conclusion that Rasputin had some sort of sexual hold over the Empress. Now, increasingly, that was used by anti-monarchists in quite pornographic attacks on the Empress and her children, her daughters. But we can obviously say now, with the publication of their letters and knowing the truth about Alexei's condition, that Rasputin's hold was not sexual, it was much deeper and perhaps much more damagingly spiritual. So, stripped of its melodrama and its myths and its gossip, we can see Nicholas II as a man who jealously protected the privileges and crushing responsibilities of sovereign. It has to be said his work ethic was impressive. He worked tirelessly, refusing to, probably foolishly, delegate even minor governmental reports to a secretary. The Tsar was of average intellectual capabilities. He wasn't stupid by any stretch of the imagination, but he lacked any real imagination. I've said imagination there twice, but I stand by it. He really was not a particularly imaginative thinker, and that is a problem in leaders, particularly when they're facing problems of the scope that Nicholas was confronted by. In the decade in which Russia had experimented with constitutionalism, Nicholas had also come to increasingly distrust most politicians, and due to a series of family dramas, he had isolated himself from his peers. Then, in the summer of 1914, Russia joined the First World War on the Allied side, and the Tsar appointed his kinsman, the Grand Duke Nicholas Mikhailovich, as commander-in-chief of the armies. The Grand Duke was a popular choice, initially. But after the de facto annihilation of the Russian cavalry by the German army at the Battle of Tannenberg, there were increasing calls for the Grand Duke to be replaced. Mounting casualty figures and ineffective distribution of military equipment saw those calls increase in volume and in number, until eventually Nicholas II bowed to pressure by installing himself as commander-in-chief in the Grand Duke's place. This was supported by some politicians, were usually told no one thought it was a good idea. But others did think there was going to be a real morale boost by having the Tsar closer to the military action. The most controversial part, and probably the worst element of the decision to appoint himself as commander-in-chief, was that during his absence from the capital, Nicholas decided to appoint the only person to whom he was really still close, his wife Alexandra, who had no political experience and almost no allies, and was totally intolerant of the suggestion that she could be wrong as regent. That was the big political mistake, I think, behind becoming commander-in-chief. But to stick to the topic at hand, what did becoming commander-in-chief do to Nicholas's ability to handle the coming political crisis? Well, even at this stage, I would argue that the litany of defeats and humanitarian horror created by the war had surprised and weakened the emperor. In the aftermath of the slaughter at the Battle of Tannenberg, one Russian general had been so devastated that he had committed suicide. Both events led to Nicholas II recording in his letters that he had started to feel a tightness in his chest and an erratic heartbeat. In another, he goes further by writing, "It feels so heavy in the left side when I breathe." Nonetheless, there were some early successes after Nicholas arrived in person at military headquarters called Stavka, namely through the city of Kiev being saved from falling to the Germans, repelling certain Bulgarian, Austrian, and German military units, and improving the supply trains. But it really was nowhere near enough to sustain an empire during a cataclysmic war that, yes, all right, Imperial Russia did not have an economy anywhere near as underdeveloped as popular myth would have us believe, but it was nonetheless supremely ill-matched against the industrialized military might of Imperial Germany. When the tide once again began to turn in a negative direction, Nicholas began to suffer what I think was very clearly a nervous breakdown. Of what particular ilk that was, as I say, I would be uncomfortable giving it specifics, but we can, or I can with you, share the accounts of those that saw him and that give us an idea that something certainly happened. The first source I'll turn to is not from one of the Tsar's friends or family, but a minister or a politician who was occasionally ambivalent or even hostile to the idea of monarchy. So this source only ever knew the Tsar in a professional or a political capacity. So his comments on what he saw in 1916 compared to 1915 are, I think, revealing. Mikhail Rodzianko, a liberal politician who served as president of the Duma and who was nicknamed Fat Rodzianko in the Tsarina's uncharitable correspondence, arrived for an audience with the Tsar at Stavka and noticed, "In comparison with last year, His Majesty's tone has changed and he has become less self-confident." A few months later, another of the Tsar's guests thought, "The Emperor has greatly aged, and his cheeks are sunken. Sitting almost opposite His Majesty and not taking my eyes from him, I could not but pay attention to his terrible nervousness, which has never existed before. It is evident that the Emperor's spirit is troubled, and that it is difficult for him to hide his agitation successfully from his entourage." Those that knew the Tsar better tell much the same story. For instance, His mother was shocked at how quiet Nicholas had become and how much he had aged. Remember, the Dowager Empress Marie and Nicholas weren't close, as close as they had been. So, because Marie, she was known as Minnie in the family, sometime when Marie saw Nicholas, it was infrequently, and I think we all know when you see people less frequently, I think you can spot changes in them more obviously than those who maybe see them every day. And so the comments that she makes in 1916 are those of a very worried mother. She sort of couldn't believe how much Nicholas had physically deteriorated in the course of that year. At times, the Tsar appeared distracted during ministerial meetings. His hands, were told, kept nervously clutching at a religious icon, and his lack of focus was commented upon by several ministers. One thing that sort of runs through even Republicans, people who were later involved sort of in keeping him under house arrest, right the way back to people like Queen Victoria. So this is sort of across the political and social spectrum. One enduring comment about Nicholas II is everyone commented on how good his manners were, that he was sort of one of the most exquisitely polite people they'd ever met, that he paid attention, that he tried to put everyone at their ease. So socially, a kind of very adept person. And so the lack of focus really struck a lot of the ministers as very out of character. There are testimonies from the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Finance. The Minister of Agriculture wrote that Nicholas, who usually was so polite, keeps on interrupting me with questions that are not related to the business of my official journey, but rather everyday trivia. And the Finance Minister says that he was unsettled by the apathetic attitude of the Emperor. Eventually, Nicholas's courtiers tried to step in. Count Paul Benkendorf, the Grand Marshal of the Imperial Court, wrote, I think, quite a sharply worded letter to Dr. Yevgeny Botkin, the Tsar's personal doctor, in which Count Benkendorf writes, "He can't continue this way much longer. His Majesty is a changed man. It is very wrong of him to attempt the impossible. He is no longer seriously interested in anything. Of late, he has become quite apathetic. He goes through his daily routine like an automaton, paying more attention to the hours set for his meals or his walk in the garden than to affairs of state. One can't rule an empire and command an army in the field in this manner. If he doesn't realize it in time, something catastrophic is bound to happen." So one of the things that I think really emerges from those testimonies is not just how lethargic, apathetic, distracted Nicholas was, but that everything he was doing in these months as Russia was buckling under the pressure of the war was out of character. So that's why I said at the start, Nicholas, we can't let the end write the entirety. Nicholas, I don't think, was a particularly weak monarch. But the nervous breakdown that happened, whether it was depression or, I say in The Emperors, the book I wrote, that to us, what he did bears all the hallmarks of the impenetrable haze and misery caused by depression. To his opponents, it was how he was to be remembered, with this depression becoming the alpha and omega of Nicholas II's political credibilities. Leon Trotsky gleefully and viciously remarked that Nicholas II had not been mentally equipped to run a village post office, let alone an empire. I didn't go into too much depth about what kind of depression it was. I think we can clearly see he was depressed. There are, multiple varieties of depression. And mental unhappiness. I think he was miserable. And you can tell. I think the letter that really stands out to me is Benkendorf's, where he goes into detail with the doctor and says, "Look, something really, really does have to be done about this." I would say that there's just such a contrast between the Nicholas of 1905 and the Nicholas of 1916. I am not launching a defence here to say that had Nicholas been at his full fighting capabilities, he would have been one of the great Tsars. He wasn't. He was adequate. And there are plenty of historians who quite rightly point out that even Tsars who were very tough, like his father, Catherine II, Peter I, Nicholas I, would probably have struggled with the sheer absolute horror of the First World War. And I also think it's really worth pointing out that when we're looking at what happened to the Russian Empire, people often talk about this inevitability of it imploding. Well, it seems to me very curious that we don't look at the fact that within the space of 18 months, it fell along with an industrial, economically prosperous empire like the German monarchy, and an older monarchy with totally different cultures and values, like the Habsburg dynasty. So I do think the war played this. I mean, to me, the war is often the elephant in the room that people try to find elaborate reasons that are more important than the war. The First World War was holocaustic horror. It's interesting that this. I mean, the future and late Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, said it was a holocaust of violence because every day someone you knew died, and that I think is the major reason why the Russian monarchy collapsed, and also why the Russian monarch collapsed. So I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that Nicholas's ill health was the sole reason for it. I would say that he was exhausted. He was heartbroken at the casualty figures. He was sincerely surprised at the sheer depth of his wife's unpopularity with the Russian people. He was tormented, as he saw it, by squabbling politicians, a disloyal and unpatriotic parliament, who were agitating on the home front for further democratic reforms, all of which he clearly felt should be suppressed in times of war. And so Nicholas II's calm and his capacity for work in those circumstances gives way to a morose nervousness. He was an insomniac. He was pathologically lethargic. And I think that meant that 1916 and 1917 were being responded to almost by a different person to the man who had responded to 1904, 1905, and 1906. The final component to his sort of mental anguish took place at the end of 1916 when Rasputin was assassinated, and it turned out that the leader of the plot had been Nicholas's nephew by marriage, Prince Felix Yusupov, and Nicholas's cousin, the Grand Duke Dmitry. They had allied with a army physician and also an ultra-monarchist politician called Vladimir Purushkevich. And this was a monarchist plot that they wanted to get rid of Rasputin, to free the monarchy from the kind of miasma of scandal that he had brought with it, and to force the Tsar to take decisive actions to remedy the situation. But what it did was it horrified Nicholas. He was morally, he saw Rasputin as a sort of promiscuous but essentially simple-minded peasant, and he thought that what Felix Yusupov had done, and Grand Duke Dmitry, had been to essentially slaughter an innocent man in the most brutal way imaginable. So I just wanted to read a little bit about the aftermath of that and what it did to Nicholas. The murder seemed to inflict far more damage on a revolted Nicholas, who was particularly aghast when members of his wider family petitioned him to show clemency to the assassins. Despite what Alexandra's many critics had hoped, she was not broken by Rasputin's death. Instead, after mourning him, the Empress seemed to continue as normal, although it is hard to tell how long that would have lasted because the monarchy itself now had so little time left. The killing of Rasputin was a desperate act carried out by men loyal to the Romanov throne who believed that their terrible crime would free the dynasty from Rasputin's baleful influence. It was ultimately a reflection of how much damage Alexandra had done in her 16 months as regent that this attack, this murder, was carried out by monarchists. Yet what Felix Yusupov and Vladimir Purushkevich intended as a sign of strength was, in reality, a display of pitiful weakness. The legitimacy and popularity of the imperial government had almost evaporated. One of the coldest winters on record was lashing the streets of Petrograd and Moscow. The railway lines were buckling in the cold. The food supplies could not reach the city, and the proper channels of political protest had reached such a nadir of effectiveness that the empire's elite had felt the only way to get things done was to trick a semi-literate peasant, poison him, shoot him, stab him, bludgeon him, and shove his body beneath the ice. Killing Rasputin did not remove the rot, it simply advertised it. Years later, Nicholas II's youngest sister, the Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, wrote from her exile in Toronto. There was nothing heroic about Rasputin's murder. Just think of the two names most closely associated with it even to this day. A Grand Duke, one of the grandsons of the Tsar Liberator, and then a scion of one of our greatest houses, whose wife was a Grand Duke's daughter. They proved how low we had fallen. Nicholas II remained at Tsarskoye Selo for 2 months following Rasputin's funeral. Those who hoped that he would use that time to rectify the problems in government were destined to disappointment. Nicholas did nothing but sink further into his malaise. The participation of his cousin and his niece's husband in the murder of his wife's spiritual adviser was a terrible blow to his already beleaguered pride. His own family had mounted a kind of rebellion against him when they killed Rasputin, conveying to the entire empire that this was the only way in which Nicholas could be trusted to seek the right advice. Some 3 million Russians had lost their lives as a result of the war. The terrible winter temperatures had heightened the problems of distributing food in the empire's major cities, and as a result, bread queues snaked through streets battered by ice and freezing winds. Despite how often it is stated and glibly assumed to be true, there was no starvation. Tsuyoshi Hasegawa has convincingly demonstrated in his paper that the Tsarist government's overall performance in handling the enormous task of food supply was not as bad as is often argued. No one in the cities starved. The collapse of the mechanism for supplying food actually came after the fall of the monarchy. Still, there were shortages, and the rationing of supplies intensified significantly when peasant farmers, worried understandably by inflation, refused to sell their crops to the government. Moving the resources that were available became more difficult because of the damage the weather had inflicted on the railways. Mixing with all this, for 2 years the monarchy had ignored the Duma. Nicholas finally agreed that he would go to the Duma in person to negotiate or stage some sort of moment of the Tsar amongst his people. But he didn't. At the very last moment, he changed his mind and went back to military headquarters. He had promised his Prime Minister, Prince Ivan Golitsyn, that he would go. The old magic of a royal appearance, the Tsar in communion with his people once again, might just work and quieten the naysayers for a few more months. It might inject the fresh vigour into politicians. More importantly, by granting concessions to the Duma, Nicholas would provide the empire with a more stable and more popular form of government. Had he stuck by that decision, who knows what would have happened? All we know for certain is that when the Prime Minister was brought back into the Tsar's study, Nicholas told him that he was going back to the front. How is that, Your Majesty? The Prime Minister asked. What about a responsible ministry? You intended to go to the Duma tomorrow. I've changed my mind, the Tsar replied. I am leaving for headquarters tonight. And as the imperial train pulled out of Tsarskoye Selo, all these factors wove together into unrest on the streets. Now, I would argue that Nicholas probably buckled on the issue of abdication precisely because he was so mentally fragile. But that would probably be to go beyond the scope of this. I hope that this video in its scope has given an insight into one particular aspect of the Russian Revolution, the Tsar's ill health. This is neither a condemnation of Nicholas, nor is it an exoneration. Many mistakes were made even before his mental ill health in 1916. However, I do think it's particularly interesting. All history, I think, is interesting, and this this story of the end of one of the greatest empires, the largest empires in human history, is just totally fascinating. Nicholas's lethargy and his flight rather than fight from these huge problems that were his duty to resolve, I think played no small role in damning the Romanov monarchy into the history pages and out of modern politics. I also think that looking at Nicholas as something other than a cipher helps us to remember we shouldn't be writing history with hindsight, always shaping what we write, and also that all of these issues are so much more complicated and nuanced than a lot of our stereotypes would allow. This has been a slightly shorter video. I quite enjoy doing the niche elements of it, but either way, I very much hope that you're all in good health and that lockdown or self-isolation or whatever the policy is in whichever part of the world you are in has been as kind to you as it can be, and I wish you and yours all the very best. Thank you.